The story reaches the table in pieces. Not shouted, not dramatized, just spoken. 5 prisoners, locked cells, no witnesses who mattered. Bumpy Johnson sits at the head of the table, fingers folded, eyes half-lidded. The room around him feels smaller than it is. Smoke hangs in the air like a curtain nobody wants to move through. One of his men clears his throat before speaking. They said it was discipline. Silence. Another man continues, voice lower. They said nobody would care. Still no reaction from Bumpy. That's when the third man speaks. The youngest. He shouldn't be the one delivering details like this, but anger pushes him forward. They beat them until one couldn't stand. 5 of them, all in the same night. The words don't echo. They sink. Outside, Harlem hums like it always does. Music from a record shop down the block. Laughter spilling from a bar. A woman arguing about prices at a fruit stand. Life moving. But inside that room, everything slows. Because this isn't about 5 prisoners. It's about a message. Detectives don't just enforce laws, they perform power. And what happened behind those walls wasn't about justice. It was about reminding men in cages that they were small. Small men break quietly. But Harlem doesn't. Bumpy leans back slightly. The chair creaks under controlled weight. He doesn't look shocked. He doesn't look outraged. He looks like a man calculating distance. Who told you? He asks finally. The question lands soft. Trustworthy, one of his captains answers. 2 guards talking, one of them nervous. Names? They weren't given. Bumpy nods once. That's enough. In that nod lies understanding. The guards were scared, which means the beating went too far, which means someone lost control. Control is everything. Violence without control is weakness wearing a uniform. Another man at the table mutters, "They think nobody's going to answer for it." Bumpy's eyes lift, not sharply, not threatening, just enough. The muttering stops immediately. He doesn't need to raise his voice. He doesn't need to threaten. His silence does the work, because every man in that room knows something the detectives don't. Harlem listens to Bumpy Johnson, not because he demands it, because he protects it. There's a difference. One of the older men shifts forward. Word is, the lieutenant was there. That changes the temperature. Lieutenants don't get their hands dirty unless they want to prove something. Laughing, the older man adds. They said he was laughing. The youngest man clenches his jaw. That's what they heard. Bumpy finally looks directly at him. Who heard? A porter, cleaning the hall after, said he heard the lieutenant say, 5 nobodies lighter. The room stiffens. Nobodies. That word travels faster than bullets. Because in Harlem, nobody is a nobody. Everyone belongs to someone. A mother, a sister, a church pew, a block that remembers their childhood. You don't beat 5 prisoners, you insult a community. Bumpy exhales slowly. Not anger, not yet. Just breath. He stands. No sudden motion. No dramatic gesture. Just rising from the chair like gravity agreed to let him. Every man at the table straightens instinctively. He walks to the window. Outside, children race down the sidewalk, arguing about who's faster. A shopkeeper sweeps dust into the street. Life, unbothered. That's what he protects. Not criminals, not reputations, balance. The detectives crossed a line they couldn't see. They thought the walls of a jail were thicker than Harlem's memory. They were wrong. Behind him, one of his men finally asks the question everyone is holding. What do we do? Bumpy doesn't answer immediately. He watches a mother grab her son's wrist before he runs into the street. He watches her pull him back without shouting. Firm, calm, control. When he turns back to the room, his voice is level. We don't do anything. Confusion flickers across faces. The youngest man protests first. But Bumpy raises a hand slightly. That's enough. We don't react, he says. Not to noise. He walks back to the table, places his hat down carefully. Noise fades. The men listen. We find out why. Why would a lieutenant risk something like that? Why would he laugh loud enough for a porter to hear? Why would he use the word nobody? Because men who feel untouchable don't whisper. They perform. Bumpy understands performance. He's been underestimated before, laughed at before, tested before. Each time he didn't respond with rage. He responded with patience, and patience is heavier than anger. He looks at the youngest man again. You said he laughed first. Yes. That's important. Laughter is careless. Laughter means he wasn't afraid, which means he doesn't believe anyone can challenge him. That belief is the real problem. Bumpy picks up his coat. Let the story spread, he says quietly. The room shifts. Let it reach the lieutenant's ears that we heard. The older captain studies him. And then? Bumpy pauses at the door. Then we see how steady he is. He leaves the room without another word. Behind him, the men remain seated for several seconds, absorbing what just happened. There was no order to attack, no plan for retaliation, no raised voices. But something far more dangerous just started. Awareness. When word reaches the lieutenant that Bumpy Johnson knows, the real test begins. Because power isn't proven in private. It's proven in how a man reacts when he realizes someone else is watching. And somewhere across the city, a detective lieutenant is about to discover that Harlem has ears, and that Bumpy Johnson doesn't need to shout to be heard. Before the uniforms, before the patrol cars idled at corners like watchful animals, there was Bumpy Johnson. Harlem doesn't remember him as a headline. It remembers him as a presence. He walks down 125th Street the next morning like he always does. Same measured pace, same dark coat, same unreadable expression. Nothing in his posture suggests he heard anything unusual the night before. That's the point. Power that panics isn't power. Shopkeepers nod as he passes. Not exaggerated, not theatrical, just respectful. A butcher steps out from behind his counter for a moment, wipes his hands on his apron, gives Bumpy a quiet greeting. Morning, Mr. Johnson. Bumpy inclines his head. How's business? Steady. Steady means safe. Safe means protected. That's the unspoken contract. He doesn't own these stores on paper. He owns something more important. Trust. Across the street, two older men sit outside a barber shop, playing chess on a small wooden table that has seen decades of arguments. They stop mid-game as he walks by. One of them smiles faintly. Afternoon's yours today? Bumpy glances at the board without slowing down. White shouldn't rush that bishop, he says calmly. The man playing white looks down, realizes he almost made a mistake, nods slowly. That's how Harlem understands him. He doesn't need to flip the board to control it. Inside a nearby cafe, word is already circulating. They heard what happened at the jail. 5 men, beaten, laughed at, called nobodies. The story grows, but not wildly. It grows carefully. Because when something concerns Bumpy Johnson, Harlem doesn't exaggerate. It observes. A woman behind the counter pours coffee and whispers, "You think he'll answer?" Her co-worker shrugs. He always does. That's not hope. That's history. Bumpy enters the cafe a few minutes later. The room straightens slightly without meaning to. Conversations lower by half a tone. He orders tea, not coffee. Always tea. He sits alone at a small corner table. He doesn't ask about the jail. He doesn't ask about the lieutenant. He waits. Waiting is an action most men misunderstand. Across town, in a precinct office that smells like old paper and arrogance, The lieutenant is hearing the same rumors. "Word is Johnson knows," one officer says, leaning against a desk. The lieutenant chuckles. "He knows what?" he replies. "That we're doing our jobs." The room laughs with him. Nervous laughter, loyal laughter, the kind men use when they want to stay aligned with power. The lieutenant adjusts his tie in the reflection of a window. "He doesn't scare me." That sentence is louder than it needs to be. Back in Harlem, Bumpy sips his tea slowly. One of his captains enters the cafe but doesn't sit. He stands near the door, close enough to speak quietly. "It reached him," the captain murmurs. Bumpy doesn't look up. "Reaction?" He laughed. A small pause. "Publicly." Bumpy finally lifts his eyes. Oh, not anger. Measurement. "How public?" "In front of his men. Said something about criminals needing reminders." Bumpy nods once. That's what he wanted. Not the laughter. The exposure. A man who laughs publicly commits publicly, which means he can't quietly retreat without losing face. The lieutenant just locked himself into a posture. Pride is rigid, and rigid things break. Bumpy finishes his tea and stands. He places money on the table, more than the cup costs. He always does. The woman behind the counter watches him carefully. "You all right, Mr. Johnson?" she asks gently. He meets her eyes. "Always," he says. And she believes him. That belief spreads faster than fear ever could. Outside, the street continues its rhythm. Vendors call out prices. A preacher stands on a crate half a block away, warning about temptation and judgment. Children weave between adults like restless spirits. This is what the lieutenant doesn't understand. He thinks power is enforced downward. Bumpy knows power rises upward, from the sidewalks, from the stoops, from the people who decide who deserves loyalty. He doesn't need to threaten the police department. He just needs Harlem to stand still behind him. Later that afternoon, Bumpy gathers a small group in a back office above a social club. Not a war council, no maps, no guns laid out for effect, just chairs. "You're not to touch anyone," he says calmly. A murmur moves through the room. One of the men leans forward. "Even after what he said?" "Especially after," Bumpy replies. Violence now would make the lieutenant a hero in his own building. It would confirm every stereotype he's comfortable believing. No, this isn't about fists. It's about balance. "We don't chase noise," Bumpy continues. "We let noise come to us." One of the older men nods slowly. He's seen this before. Years ago, when another official tried to humiliate Harlem publicly, that man transferred within months, not because of bloodshed, because doors quietly stopped opening for him. Information stopped flowing. Cooperation became slow. Bumpy doesn't control the law. He controls the temperature. And a man who feels cold enough will either step closer for warmth or freeze. That evening, as the sun lowers behind the brownstones, the lieutenant receives a call, not a threat, an invitation. A mutual acquaintance suggests a meeting. Neutral ground, no press, no uniforms on display. The lieutenant hesitates. For the first time, hesitation. "Is this a negotiation?" he asks. The answer comes back simple. It's a conversation. He almost declines. Almost. But something about knowing Bumpy Johnson heard the story unsettles him in a way he won't admit aloud. Because laughter is easy in a room full of subordinates. It's different when you might have to repeat it face to face. Back in Harlem, Bumpy stands at his window as evening settles. Streetlights flicker on one by one. The city hum softens into night rhythm. One of his men approaches quietly. "He agreed," the man says. Bumpy doesn't turn around. "Good." The man waits, expecting more instruction. There isn't any, because Harlem already knows its king, and kings don't rush toward battles. They wait for challengers to step into the light. The lieutenant chooses the location, a social club just outside Harlem's edge, close enough to send a message, far enough to feel safe. He arrives first. 2 patrol cars linger half a block away. Not obvious, not subtle either. Insurance. Inside, the lighting is low. Jazz hums softly from a speaker near the bar. A few men play cards at a back table, pretending not to watch the door. The lieutenant removes his hat and scans the room like he's inspecting property. He tells himself this is strategy. He tells himself this is control. When Bumpy Johnson enters, the room doesn't react loudly. It adjusts. Chairs straighten. Conversations pause mid-sentence. The card game slows, then stops. No one stands to announce him. They don't need to. Bumpy walks in alone. No visible protection, no entourage pressing behind him. That's the first mistake the lieutenant makes. He expected numbers. Instead, he gets stillness. They face each other across a small wooden table. The lieutenant sits first. Another mistake. Bumpy removes his gloves carefully before taking his seat, places them beside his hat. Small, deliberate movements. No rush. For a moment, neither man speaks. The lieutenant breaks the silence. "I hear you've been asking questions." His tone is almost amused. Bumpy studies him the way a chess player studies an opponent who moved too quickly. "I hear you've been answering them," Bumpy replies calmly. The lieutenant smiles. Too wide. "We maintain order. That's our job." "5 men?" Bumpy asks softly. The lieutenant shrugs. 5 criminals. There it is again. Reduction. Minimizing human beings into something easier to strike. The jazz continues in the background, steady and patient. Bumpy leans back slightly. "Criminals still belong to someone," he says. "They still have names." The lieutenant's jaw tightens for a fraction of a second. "You claiming them?" "I'm claiming Harlem." That lands heavier than any threat. Because Harlem isn't a gang, it's a place. And claiming a place means claiming the people inside it. The lieutenant chuckles again, but the sound is thinner now. "You don't run this city." "No," Bumpy agrees. "I don't." A pause. "But I don't lose it either." The lieutenant shifts in his chair. He didn't come for philosophy. He came to assert dominance, to show he wouldn't be intimidated, so he leans forward. "Let me be clear," he says quietly. "If my men decide someone needs reminding who's in charge, that's not your concern." There it is. Not an apology, not a denial, a line drawn. Around them, the air tightens. The card players aren't pretending anymore. They're listening openly. The bartender polishes the same glass twice. Bumpy doesn't flinch. "Control your men," he says. It's not loud. It's not aggressive. It's instruction. The lieutenant laughs again, but this time it's forced. "Or what?" There it is. The question men ask when they mistake calm for weakness. Bumpy doesn't answer immediately. He looks at the lieutenant's hands, restless. Fingers tapping the table lightly, a man who needs motion to feel secure. Then he looks at his eyes. Not steady, performing. "You laughed," Bumpy says instead. The lieutenant stiffens. "Excuse me?" "You laughed loud enough for the hallway to hear." A flicker. Brief, almost invisible. The lieutenant didn't expect that detail. Bumpy continues. "Men who are sure of themselves don't need an audience." Silence. The jazz track ends. A new one begins. Slower. The lieutenant straightens his back. "You think this is about pride?" "I think," Bumpy says calmly, "you wanted someone to hear you." That's the second mistake the lieutenant makes. He lets irritation show. "I don't answer to you." "No," Bumpy agrees again. "You answer to your badge." A pause. But badges don't protect reputations. The lieutenant's jaw tightens harder now. "You threatening me?" Bumpy tilts his head slightly. "If I were threatening you," he says softly, You wouldn't be asking. That line lands. Not explosive, not shouted, just certain. The lieutenant realizes something uncomfortable in that moment. Bumpy isn't angry. He's assessing, and assessment is colder than rage. You've made your point, the lieutenant says finally, standing up too quickly. Another mistake. Standing first gives the illusion of control, but leaving early gives it away. Bumpy remains seated. I haven't, he replies. The lieutenant pauses halfway to turning his back. You will not use Harlem to perform strength, Bumpy says. Not publicly. The words are measured, balanced, final. The lieutenant hesitates. For a brief second, he considers softening, adjusting, offering a compromise disguised as confidence. Instead, pride takes over. I'll do my job, he says, however I see fit. And he walks out. The patrol cars outside pull away with him. Inside the club, the air releases slowly. One of the card players exhales. That didn't go well. Bumpy stands calmly, putting his gloves back on. It went exactly how it needed to, he says, because now it's clear. The lieutenant chose ego over wisdom. He chose performance over stability. And men who choose pride publicly must defend it publicly, which means the next move won't be whispered. It will be visible. As Bumpy steps back into the Harlem night, streetlights casting long shadows across the pavement, he doesn't look troubled. He looks patient, because the lieutenant thinks the meeting ended. But what really happened was simpler. He proved he could lose control, and once a man shows that weakness, the entire city begins to test it. The lieutenant wakes up the next morning expecting noise, retaliation, sirens, a statement disguised as revenge. He gets none of it. Harlem opens its doors like it always does. Vendors set up fruit stands. Tailors roll up metal gates. Music drifts from apartment windows with the smell of frying onions and fresh bread. Everything looks normal. That's the first wait. Because when a man prepares for impact and nothing hits him, he starts to question where the blow will land. At the precinct, the lieutenant carries himself louder than usual. He jokes harder, speaks sharper, assigns patrol routes with a little more edge in his voice. Make sure you sweep Lenox twice, he tells one officer. Let them see you. Let them see you. But when patrol cars roll through Harlem, something subtle has changed. People don't scatter. They don't argue. They don't react at all. They simply watch. And when you're used to provoking fear, indifference feels like disrespect. A patrolman steps into a corner store to ask about a petty theft reported the night before. The owner shrugs. Didn't see anything. You always see something, the patrolman replies. Not yesterday. The answer is polite, calm, final. Across the street, a numbers runner closes his notebook early. A bartender locks his door 15 minutes before closing. A woman who usually chats with officers about neighborhood gossip suddenly remembers she has somewhere else to be. Information slows, not dramatically, just enough. By midday, the lieutenant starts hearing complaints. People aren't talking, one detective says. They're talking, the lieutenant snaps. Just not to you. But he feels it. That thin layer of cooperation he relied on, the casual tips, the nods toward suspicious movement, the quiet warnings, it's thinning. And he knows thinning can become absence. Back in Harlem, Bumpy Johnson sits in a modest office above a funeral home. The air smells faintly of polish and old wood. 3 men stand before him. No confrontations, Bumpy says evenly. One of them nods. What about the usual payments? On time, Bumpy replies. Stability must never look like weakness. He stands and walks to the window again. He favors windows lately. They remind him what he's protecting. Down below, 2 officers walk the sidewalk. Nobody challenges them. Nobody smiles at them either. Balance. Make sure the churches know, Bumpy says quietly. The men exchange glances. Know what? That we prefer peace. It sounds simple. But when word travels through pastors and choir leaders and mothers on stoops, it carries weight. Peace isn't surrender. It's discipline. By evening, the lieutenant feels something unfamiliar in his precinct. Silence. Reports come in slower. Witness statements are shorter. Calls for minor disturbances drop unexpectedly. One of his sergeants approaches carefully. "Sir, could be coincidence. But it's like they're handling things themselves." Handling things themselves. The lieutenant bristles. "That's obstruction." "Technically, sir, they're not breaking anything. That's the problem. Nothing illegal is happening. Nothing visible. Just a subtle withdrawal of cooperation." He slams a folder onto his desk harder than necessary. "They think they can freeze us out?" No one answers, because everyone in the room understands something he doesn't want to admit. Harlem doesn't need to shout to resist. It just needs to close its doors quietly. Meanwhile, Bumpy walks through the neighborhood that night without an escort. A young boy runs up to him, breathless. "Mr. Johnson, my mama said thank you." "For what?" Bumpy asks gently. The boy shrugs. "She just said thank you." Bumpy nods. That's enough. A group of older men stand near a lamppost as he passes. One of them speaks softly. "It's colder today." Bumpy glances around at the warm summer air. "Yes," he says. "It is." They all understand. Cold isn't temperature. Cold is distance. Across town, the lieutenant receives a phone call from someone higher up. There have been murmurs, community leaders asking questions, city officials wondering why cooperation dipped overnight. The lieutenant assures them it's temporary, a minor fluctuation. But his confidence isn't as steady as it was 2 days ago. Because pressure without violence feels unnatural. It doesn't justify retaliation. It doesn't validate force. It simply lingers. That night, he drives alone through Harlem without flashing lights. He notices the way conversations stop as he passes, not out of fear, out of evaluation. He parks and steps out of the car, determined to prove something to himself. A few men stand outside a closed hardware store. He approaches. "Everything all right here?" "Yes, officer," one of them replies calmly. No sarcasm, no hostility, just controlled politeness. The lieutenant searches their faces for mockery. He finds none, which unsettles him more. He realizes something then. He isn't being challenged. He's being measured. And there's nothing more destabilizing to a man who craves authority than feeling observed instead of obeyed. Back in his office later, he pours himself a drink from a bottle hidden in the bottom drawer. Just one. He tells himself it's to unwind. But as the liquid burns down his throat, he replays the meeting in the club. "If I were threatening you, you wouldn't be asking." The words echo now, because Bumpy never raised his voice, never made a demand he couldn't enforce. He simply set a boundary. And now the lieutenant feels the boundary pressing inward. Meanwhile, Harlem sleeps peacefully. No shootings, no broken windows, no public retaliation, just a community aligned. And alignment is heavier than chaos. In his apartment, Bumpy sits in near darkness, a lamp casting a soft glow over a chessboard on a small table. He moves a piece slowly. A pawn. Forward 1 square. Not dramatic, not flashy, but patient. Because pressure doesn't need to explode. It just needs to remind a man that he isn't untouchable. And somewhere in the city, a lieutenant who once laughed loudly is beginning to understand something simple. Silence can squeeze tighter than violence ever could. The second meeting isn't arranged publicly. No intermediaries, no invitations delivered through mutual friends. The lieutenant requests it himself. That's how Bumpy knows the temperature has shifted. They meet in a municipal building after hours. Fluorescent lights hum softly overhead. The kind of place designed to feel official, sterile, unquestionable. Authority lives in buildings like this, but power doesn't. The lieutenant stands near a long conference table when Bumpy enters. No patrol cars this time. No audience of officers pretending not to listen. Just two men and the echo of their own footsteps. "You wanted to talk," Bumpy says evenly. The lieutenant doesn't sit. He paces once, then stops. "There's been disruption," he begins. Bumpy says nothing. "People aren't cooperating. Tips dried up. Witnesses suddenly don't remember things." He studies Bumpy's face, looking for satisfaction. He finds none. "That concerns you?" Bumpy asks calmly. "It concerns the city." "Then perhaps the city should consider why it happened." The lieutenant's jaw tightens, but he controls it this time. No laughter, no smirking. "That's not how this works," he says. Bumpy tilts his head slightly. "Explain how it works." The lieutenant hesitates, because explaining power out loud makes it fragile. "We enforce the law," he says finally. "Communities cooperate. That's the arrangement." "And respect?" Bumpy asks. "That's earned." "Exactly." The word lands softly. The lieutenant exhales through his nose. He's tired. Not physically, mentally. He underestimated the ripple effect of one careless night, one careless laugh. "I didn't order anything illegal," he says, almost defensively. Bumpy steps closer. Not aggressively, just enough to narrow the distance. "I never said you did." Silence stretches between them. What happened to the 5 prisoners is no longer the center of the room. Control is. "You think you can freeze us out whenever you're offended?" the lieutenant asks. Bumpy's expression doesn't change. "This isn't offense," he replies. "This is balance." The fluorescent lights flicker briefly overhead. "Balance?" the lieutenant repeats. "You embarrassed men publicly," Bumpy says. "You reduced them to nothing, and you did it loud." A pause. Harlem heard. The lieutenant looks away for a moment. That's new. He remembers the hallway, the porter, the echo of his own voice as he laughed. At the time, it felt powerful. Now it feels reckless. "What do you want?" he asks quietly. There it is. Not, "What are you threatening?" Not, "What's your next move?" "What do you want?" Bumpy doesn't answer immediately. He walks to the window at the end of the room, looks down at the empty street below, streetlights glowing steady. "I want stability," he says. The lieutenant almost laughs again, but stops himself. "Stability," he repeats carefully. "You control your men," Bumpy continues. "You don't perform strength at the expense of my community. And if criminals step out of line, they answer for it," Bumpy says, "privately." The word hangs in the air, privately, not as spectacle, not as theater. The lieutenant studies him. "You're asking for influence over police conduct." "I'm asking for restraint." Another silence. This one feels different, less sharp, more reflective. The lieutenant realizes something he's been avoiding. The drop in cooperation isn't chaos, it's coordination. And coordination means leadership. "You didn't tell them to stop talking to us," he says slowly. Bumpy turns from the window. "I didn't tell them to do anything. That's the truth. He didn't give orders. He set an example. Harlem followed, because respect is contagious when modeled." The lieutenant runs a hand over his face. "I can't admit wrongdoing," he says. "Not officially." "I didn't ask you to." "Then what changes?" Bumpy steps closer to the table. "You stop laughing." It's almost quiet enough to miss. The lieutenant looks up. "You show control. Your men will follow." "And if they don't?" Bumpy meets his eyes fully now. "Then you lose control." No threat, no raised voice, just inevitability. The lieutenant understands. This isn't a negotiation between equals. It's a recognition of territories. The badge governs the law. Bumpy governs the temperature of Harlem. If those two forces clash publicly, the city fractures. If they align quietly, the city stabilizes. Finally, the lieutenant nods once. I'll speak to my men. Not an apology, but a shift. That's wise, Bumpy replies. The tension in the room eases, not dramatically, just enough. The lieutenant straightens his jacket. And the cooperation? Bumpy picks up his gloves. Stability returns when balance returns. He walks toward the door. Just before leaving, he pauses. One more thing. The lieutenant waits. Those 5 prisoners, Bumpy says softly. They still have names. The lieutenant swallows. I understand. For the first time, he means it. When Bumpy exits the building, the night air feels lighter. No victory parade, no celebration, just quiet recalibration. Inside the conference room, the lieutenant sits down slowly. He replays the conversation. He realizes something that unsettles him more than anger ever could. He wasn't threatened. He was instructed, and he listened. Control didn't change hands through violence. It shifted through composure, through patience, through a man who never raised his voice. Outside, Harlem continues breathing steadily. And somewhere between badge and burrow, a new understanding settles in. Power isn't about who can shout louder. It's about who can remain calm longest.